Thank you for being here. Grab a warm glass of water, sit down, and listen. You never really know how much your life is worth until someone puts a price tag on it. For Madeline, my life was worth exactly the price of a luxury wedding in Tuscany. I was 28 years old, trapped in the dark void of a medically induced coma, my heart failing quietly. Neobandange kotuenai, haichatoy biet bandanger do, vameza ronya. I thought the medical emergency was the worst part of that day. I was utterly wrong. To understand how someone could look at a failing heart monitor and see only a financial opportunity, you have to understand the life I had built far away from them. I am 28 years old, and for the last 6 years I have worked as a pediatric nurse. But my real pride and joy was a small, independent rehabilitation center I founded for children with physical disabilities. I poured every ounce of my soul and every single dollar of my savings into that place. The walls were painted in soft pastel colors, and the hallways always smelled of faint lavender and clean linens. It was a safe haven. It was everything my childhood home was not. My best friend Hannah managed the front desk and the administrative chaos. She was the sister I always wanted but never had. We spent our evenings organizing patient files, sharing cheap takeout, and dreaming about expanding our little sanctuary. I had successfully detached myself from the toxicity of my biological family, or so I thought. Madeline and Jessica lived in a different universe. Madeline was a woman obsessed with the illusion of high society. She spent her days attending charity luncheons she could barely afford and maintaining a perfectly curated social media presence. Jessica, my older sister, was the golden child who had never worked a hard day in her life. She was currently planning an extravagant destination wedding in Italy, completely funded by credit cards and Madeline's dwindling bank accounts. They never visited my clinic. They never asked about my patients. When my phone rang and Madeline's name flashed on the screen, it was never to ask how I was doing. It was always a transactional conversation. A demand for a quick loan to cover a designer dress or a heavy sigh about how embarrassing it was that I drove a 7-year-old sedan while Jessica was leasing a luxury SUV. I always kept my responses brief and polite. I had learned early on that offering them emotion only gave them ammunition. I kept my distance, believing that my financial independence was my ultimate shield. I had built a net worth of nearly $500,000 entirely tied up in the clinic's equity and my personal savings. I was proud of that number. It represented countless overtime shifts, sleepless nights, and relentless dedication to the children who needed me. But to Madeline and Jessica, my success was just an untapped reserve. They viewed my independence not as an achievement, but as an insult to their financial struggles. They were drowning in debt to maintain a facade while I was quietly thriving in reality. I thought the physical distance between us was enough to keep my sanctuary safe. I thought my boundaries were solid. I simply underestimated the depths of their entitlement. They never saw my worth. At the absolute center of my world was a little boy named Leo. He was 6 years old, born with a severe congenital condition, and had spent his entire short life bouncing between cold foster homes and sterile hospital wards. When he first arrived at my clinic, he was terrified of his own shadow, but over the months we bonded. We worked through his physical therapy together, celebrating every tiny milestone. His laughter became the background music of my life. I was not just his nurse anymore. I was in the final stages of legally adopting him. The paperwork was thick, the background checks were exhaustive, and the legal fees were steep, but I did not care. Leo was my family. I had prepared a small bedroom for him in my apartment, painted with stars and planets, waiting for the day he could finally come home. The adoption agency had scheduled the final sign-off. We were exactly 72 hours away from standing before a family court judge to make it official. 72 hours from Leo finally having a permanent address, a real bed, and a mother who would never view him as a burden. He would hold my hand, look up at me with those wide, trusting eyes, and softly call me Mom. It was the purest form of love I had ever known. I had everything meticulously planned. The financial stability of the clinic ensured I could provide for all his medical needs. The support system I had built with Hannah meant he would always be surrounded by people who cherished him. I was so close to the finish line. I could practically feel the warmth of the judge's signature on that final decree. But fate has a cruel way of reminding you how fragile life truly is. You can build the strongest walls, plan for every conceivable outcome, and secure every legal document, but you cannot negotiate with your own biology. My heart, the very organ that poured so much love into Leo, was secretly holding a devastating flaw. It was a ticking time bomb waiting for the absolute worst moment to detonate. I spent that Tuesday afternoon reviewing Leo's adoption files, double-checking every signature. I remember tracing my fingers over his photograph attached to the legal brief, feeling an overwhelming surge of protectiveness. I promised him silently that nobody would ever make him feel unwanted again. I promised to be the shield between him and the coldness of the world. I did not realize that I was the one who was about to need a shield. I did not know that the people who shared my DNA were waiting in the shadows, ready to tear my carefully constructed life apart the moment I showed a sign of weakness. The clock was ticking down. It happened on a Wednesday morning. There was no dramatic warning, no cinematic pain clutching my chest. I was standing near the front desk handing a clipboard to Hannah when the room simply tilted. The bright pastel colors of the clinic washed into a sudden terrifying gray. A heavy, suffocating silence rushed into my ears, drowning out the sound of the children playing in the therapy room. I remember the floor rushing up to meet me, and then absolute nothingness. A severe acute cardiac failure. My heart had quietly stopped functioning properly, plunging my body into a desperate survival mode. When awareness finally returned, it did not come with the ability to move or speak. I was completely paralyzed, trapped inside the sterile walls of an intensive care unit at Boston General. The rhythmic mechanical hiss of a ventilator filled the air. I was in a medically induced coma to protect my brain function, experiencing a temporary locked-in state. I could hear the rustle of medical scrubs, the beep of the monitors, and the hushed voices of the staff. I could perceive my environment perfectly, but my eyelids felt like they were made of lead. I heard the familiar, steady voice of Dr. Galvin, the attending physician who had mentored me for years. He was explaining my condition to someone in the room. He spoke of stabilization of the critical window for intervention and of a strong prognosis if we proceeded with the specialized cardiac procedure. He sounded cautiously optimistic. Then the heavy, cloying scent of expensive designer perfume invaded the clinical air of the room. It was an unmistakable scent. Madeline had arrived. I expected to hear the frantic questions of a worried mother. I expected the sound of tears or at least a tremble of concern. Instead, the sharp, rhythmic click of Jessica's high heels echoed against the linoleum floor, followed by Madeline's perfectly composed, chillingly flat voice. She did not ask if I was in pain. She did not ask Dr. Galvin about the survival rate. Dr. Madeline set her tone as casual as if she were discussing a delay in a restaurant reservation. What exactly is this going to cost? Even without opening my eyes, I could feel the temperature in the room drop. Dr. Galvin paused, clearly taken aback by the sheer emotional bankruptcy of the question. He slowly explained the necessity of the procedure, the extended ICU stay, and the potential out-of-pocket maximums. There was a brief silence. Then Jessica spoke up, annoyance dripping from every syllable. "Mom, the final payment for the Tuscan villa is due on Friday. We can't have her assets tied up in endless hospital bills. It will ruin everything." They were standing right beside my bed. My chest was rising and falling by the grace of a machine, my life hanging by a fragile thread. They were calculating their inheritance. To comprehend the sheer coldness of that conversation, you have to look back at the foundation of my existence. I was born with a minor heart defect, an anomaly that required careful monitoring and expensive medications throughout my childhood. From the moment I was old enough to understand the concept of currency, Madeline ensured I knew exactly how much my survival impacted her lifestyle. While other children worried about spelling tests or making friends, I worried about co-pays and deductibles. My earliest memory is sitting at the kitchen table, watching Madeline aggressively punch numbers into a calculator while sorting through a stack of medical bills. She would look at me, her eyes devoid of maternal warmth, and sigh heavily. "Your heart is burning through our savings, Aaliyah," she would say. It was a mantra repeated so often it became the soundtrack of my youth. The contrast between Jessica and me was staggering. Jessica was perfectly healthy, breathtakingly beautiful, and the undisputed center of Madeline's universe. When Jessica wanted a new designer dress for the homecoming dance, the funds magically appeared. When she demanded a luxury car for her sweet 16, Madeline maxed out a credit card without a second thought. Jessica was viewed as an investment, a golden ticket to elevate the family's social standing. I, on the other hand, was a liability, a walking, breathing financial drain. Whenever I asked for a new pair of shoes because the soles were wearing thin, Madeline would shake her head, her face twisting into an expression of profound martyrdom. "We just paid for your cardiology appointment. You have to learn to sacrifice. Jessica needs to look presentable for her college interviews." I internalized the guilt completely. I learned to minimize my presence. I stopped asking for anything. I got a part-time job the minute I turned 15, working late shifts at a local diner just to pay for my own school supplies and the occasional prescription refill. I wanted to cost them absolutely nothing. I believed that if I could achieve perfect financial invisibility, maybe Madeline would look at me with something resembling love. It never happened. The resentment was a permanent fixture in her eyes. I realized very early that in Madeline's world, a person's worth was strictly measured by their balance sheet. If you were not actively funding her vanity, you were entirely useless. That realization was the catalyst for my fierce independence. It drove me to build the clinic, to save every penny, and to construct a life where I would never have to rely on their toxic charity. I thought my success had finally separated me from their grasp. But lying paralyzed in that hospital bed, listening to them prioritize a wedding venue over my beating heart, the brutal truth washed over me. I was never a daughter to them. I was just an expense. In the terrifying silence of my hospital room, my mind clung to the one thing Madeline did not know. I was paralyzed, but I was not entirely defenseless. My clinic was not just a standalone building anymore. For the past 6 months, I had been quietly sitting in high-rise conference rooms, negotiating a massive merger with one of the largest pediatric nonprofits on the East Coast. I wanted to guarantee that Leo and children like him would never have to worry about funding or resources again. The ink on the preliminary agreement was barely dry. I remembered the heavy weight of the expensive pen in my hand and the sharp, serious eyes of my corporate attorney, Vivian. We had spent hours agonizing over the fine print to protect my life's work. Vivian was a legal shark who understood the darker side of human nature. She insisted we insert a highly specific, non-negotiable clause into the core of the contract. It was a corporate poison pill. If the ownership or financial control of my clinic transferred abruptly without my direct, legally notarized consent in person, it would automatically trigger an immediate, exhaustive forensic audit of all affiliated accounts by the Transferred and Viver Indevelopate, nonprofit's federal-level legal team. I put that clause there to protect my sanctuary from hostile corporate takeovers or fraudulent business partners. I never imagined it would be the exact trap my own mother would walk blindly into. Madeline thought seizing my assets would be as simple as signing a piece of paper and routing the funds to her bank account. She had no idea that touching my accounts would set off a financial alarm that could not be silenced. The trap was already set. As the days blurred together into a continuous loop of mechanical hisses and beeping monitors, I became a silent witness to their true nature. Madeline stood at the foot of my bed, completely unbothered by the tubes and wires keeping me anchored to this world. She was on her cell phone, her voice sharp and demanding, as she negotiated the price of imported floral arrangements with a wedding planner in Italy. When she finally ended the call, Jessica let out a loud theatrical sigh. "Mom, if she stays in this coma much longer, the hospital bills are going to eat into her savings. We need that money to clear my credit cards before the wedding." The venue requires the final $50,000 deposit by Friday. Madeline did not reprimand her daughter for being so utterly callous. Instead, she agreed. To a narcissist like Madeline, my medical crisis was not a tragedy. It was a severe inconvenience. It was a classic narcissistic injury. She did not look at my motionless body and see a daughter fighting to breathe. She looked at me and saw a blocked transaction. In her twisted reality, my refusal to wake up quickly or pass away quietly was a personal attack against her social calendar. She had spent my entire life conditioning me to believe that my medical needs were a financial burden she had graciously tolerated. Now my existence was actively threatening Jessica's perfect, heavily filtered wedding day. They were not grieving my potential death. They were simply annoyed by the logistical delay it caused in their spending spree. I was just an obstacle. The heavy door to my ICU room swung open, and the familiar, steady footsteps of Dr. Galvin approached my bed. He spoke directly to Madeline and Jessica, his voice carrying the professional gravity of a man who fought death every single day. He explained that my heart was stabilizing, but to secure my survival and wake me from the locked-in state, I needed an immediate, highly specialized cardiac intervention. The procedure was complex, and the out-of-pocket costs, even with my premium insurance, would be substantial. He asked Madeline, as my next of kin on paper, to sign the financial authorization and the medical consent forms. The room fell dead silent. I could hear the faint rustle of Madeline shifting her designer handbag from one shoulder to the other. Dr. Madeline said, her voice dripping with perfectly manufactured sorrow, "Aaliyah has suffered enough. Her heart has always been so weak. I cannot, in good conscience, put her through an invasive surgery just to prolong her misery." Dr. Galvin was stunned. He tried to argue, emphasizing my youth, my strength, and the very high chances of a full recovery. But Madeline held her ground. She did not just refuse the financial authorization to save her own money. She took it a devastating step further. She looked the doctor dead in the eye and demanded to execute a Do Not Resuscitate order. She wanted to legally bind the hands of the medical staff if my heart gave out again. She was signing my death warrant to protect a destination wedding. She chose the dress. The betrayal of the Do Not Resuscitate order was a cold knife to my chest, but the true depth of their cruelty was yet to be revealed. Later that evening, a new voice entered my room. It was a man speaking in low, clipped tones. It was Madeline's lawyer. He was running through a list of my assets, coldly calculating how quickly they could liquidate my clinic and empty my savings accounts once I was declared legally gone. Then he paused. I heard the sharp rustle of thick paper. "There is a severe complication, Madeline," the lawyer said. "Your daughter is in the final stages of a legal adoption. There is a 6-year-old boy named Leo. If the adoption goes through, or if she wakes up, he becomes her sole legal heir. You will get absolutely nothing." Madeline gasped. It was not a gasp of surprise that she was about to be a grandmother. It was pure, unadulterated financial panic. Jessica scoffed loudly, the sound vibrating with disgust. "A crippled orphan? Are you kidding me? She was going to give our money to a charity case?" Madeline did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She immediately asked the lawyer how to stop the process. Because I was incapacitated, she intended to step in as my legal representative and formally withdraw the adoption petition. She was going to send Leo back into the cold, unforgiving foster system. She was willing to break the heart of a little boy who had already lost everything just to ensure her hands could grasp my bank accounts. They crossed the line. Hannah finally managed to slip into my room the next morning when Madeline stepped out for coffee. She held my hand, her fingers trembling with suppressed rage. Dr. Galvin stood beside her, his jaw tight. They had just received a chilling notice from the hospital's legal department. Madeline was not just waiting for me to fade away, she was actively filing for an emergency conservatorship. For those who do not understand the dark, terrifying underbelly of the probate court system, a conservatorship is designed to protect the vulnerable. But in the hands of a predator, it is a legal weapon of mass destruction. By finding a morally bankrupt doctor to sign off that I was completely devoid of cognitive function, Madeline could bypass my human rights entirely. She would become the legal dictator of my life. She could sell my clinic, drain my savings, cancel my health insurance, and permanently block Leo's adoption, all with the swift strike of a judge's gavel. The legal system assumes that a mother inherently wants what is best for her daughter. The system is incredibly naive. It hands over the keys to your entire existence based on a few sheets of paper and a biological connection. Hannah squeezed my hand, whispering that they were fighting the hospital administration, that they were trying to buy time. But time was the one currency I was rapidly running out of. I was locked inside my own paralyzed body, forced to watch them build a legal cage around my life. The law was their weapon. Dr. Galvin was a man of strict science and unwavering ethics, not a politician. He completely refused to bend to Madeline's aggressive legal threats. Medical protocol clearly dictated that a patient could not be declared permanently incapacitated or brain dead after merely 48 hours of a sudden cardiac event. He stonewalled her hired attorneys, citing hospital regulations and federal patient protection guidelines. Madeline, quickly realizing that the quiet, sterile corridors of the intensive care unit were entirely immune to her typical methods of bullying, decided to change her battleground. She took her performance directly to the streets. Hannah had intentionally left the small television mounted in my room on a low volume to provide some comforting background noise. That afternoon, the local news broadcast suddenly cut to a live feed stationed just outside the hospital's main glass entrance. There stood Madeline. She was wearing a perfectly tailored dark blazer, her makeup meticulously applied to make her look naturally exhausted and heartbroken. She held a crumpled tissue, delicately dabbing at eyes that held absolutely no genuine moisture. "They are keeping my daughter hostage," Madeline told the cluster of reporters, her voice quivering with expertly practiced sorrow. "My poor Aaliyah is gone. The doctors know it, but they are stubbornly keeping her hooked up to these terrible machines just to drain her estate with endless daily fees. As her mother, I am begging them to let her rest in peace." Jessica stood slightly behind her, looking appropriately somber, making sure her designer profile was perfectly captured by the cameras. I watched the screen from my frozen, paralyzed state. It was an absolute masterclass in psychological manipulation. Madeline was skillfully painting the prestigious hospital as a greedy corporate villain while positioning herself as the tragic, grieving mother fighting for her child's dignity. In reality, she was desperately fighting the hospital clock. She knew that every passing hour increased the statistical probability that I might wake up. If I regained consciousness, the emergency conservatorship would dissolve instantly. The $500,000 she needed for Jessica's Tuscan wedding would remain completely out of her reach. She needed massive public pressure to force Dr. Galvin's hand before my brain synapses decided to reconnect. The news anchors in the studio nodded sympathetically at the screen. They bought the narrative completely. They did not see a financial predator circling a wounded animal. They saw a devastated family in mourning. Madeline was using the media to build a narrative so loud and persuasive that it would drown out any legal defense I had left. The cameras loved her tears. While Madeline was busy orchestrating a shameful media circus on the concrete pavement outside, a very quiet rebellion was taking place inside my isolated room. The human body is a remarkable, stubborn machine. Despite the acute cardiac failure, my brain had not been starved of oxygen long enough to sustain permanent damage. The locked-in state was a temporary traumatic response, a heavy neurological fog that was slowly beginning to thin out. It was late evening. The harsh fluorescent lights above my bed were dimmed to a soft glow. Hannah was sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside me reading a novel aloud. She had held my hand for hours, stubbornly refusing to leave my side even when her shift had officially ended. I focused every single ounce of my available willpower on my right index finger. It felt exactly like trying to move a solid mountain with a single fragile thought. I visualized the electrical connection from my brain down my spine, traveling through the nerves in my arm. Push, move, just 1 inch. My index finger twitched slightly against Hannah's palm. Hannah stopped reading immediately. She froze her eyes, darting down to my resting hand. "Aaliyah," she whispered, her voice trembling with sudden adrenaline. "Did you just do that? Do it again. Please, do it again." I gathered the scattered fragments of my strength and squeezed her hand. It was terribly weak, barely a flutter of physical pressure, but it was absolutely deliberate. It was real. Hannah hit the emergency call button frantically. Dr. Galvin practically sprinted into the room seconds later. He leaned over me, pulling out a small medical penlight. He checked my pupils, his face a mask of intense professional concentration. "Aaliyah, if you can hear me right now, blink twice." The physical effort was agonizing, but I forced my heavy eyelids down once and then again. A massive, silent wave of relief washed over Hannah's face. Dr. Galvin let out a long breath, stepping back from the bed railing. "Her neurological pathways are actively firing," he said quietly. "She is fully conscious. The paralysis is finally breaking." Hannah leaned in close, her happy tears falling onto the pristine white hospital gown. "We have to tell them. We have to tell the press outside so they stop this madness." I blinked frantically, staring at Hannah with all the fierce intensity I could muster. One blink meant no. No. We tell no one. If Madeline knew I was waking up, she would accelerate her legal filings to secure the permanent conservatorship before my vocal cords recovered. I needed time to gather my legal weapons. I needed Madeline to feel completely confident in her fraudulent victory, so she would make a fatal, undeniable mistake. She wanted a ghost on paper to steal from. I would show her exactly what a lifeless body could do to an empire of lies. The ghost was finally awake. The physical recovery was exceptionally slow and brutal. Over the next 48 hours, the suffocating paralysis slowly retreated from my vocal cords. My throat was terribly raw and scraped from the invasive medical tubes, and every single breath felt like swallowing crushed glass. But I could finally whisper. My quiet hospital room quickly became a covert war room. Dr. Galvin officially restricted all visitor access, citing severe infection control protocols. This brilliantly, effectively locked Madeline and Jessica out of the ICU wing entirely. They were furious about being denied entry, but it gave Hannah and me the uninterrupted golden silence we desperately needed to operate. Check the personal accounts, I rasped to Hannah, my voice barely above a dry breeze. The emergency conservatorship gave her temporary financial access yesterday morning. See what she did. Hannah opened her laptop, swiftly logging into my secure banking portal using the complex passwords I whispered to her. The bright screen illuminated her face in the dim room. I watched her jaw tighten dangerously as she scrolled through the recent pending transactions. She did not need to say a single word. Her grim expression confirmed every dark suspicion I harbored. Madeline didn't waste a single second, Hannah said, her tone laced with absolute disgust. Yesterday afternoon, exactly 2 hours after the probate judge granted the temporary emergency access, there was a massive outgoing wire transfer, $50,000. Where did it go? I asked, staring at the ceiling tiles. A catering and luxury event management company, Hannah replied, reading the screen closely. Based in Florence, Italy, the memo line literally says, Jessica's wedding, final deposit. There it was, the undeniable numeric proof. While Madeline was crying on local television about wanting me to rest in peace, her manicured fingers were busy authorizing international wire transfers to fund a luxury party. She was actively liquidating the sanctuary I built for disabled children so her golden child could eat imported truffles under the Tuscan sun. I did not cry. I did not feel a single pang of familial sorrow. Emotion makes you reckless and anger makes you foolish. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical clarity. Madeline had just voluntarily handed me the exact piece of evidence I needed to completely destroy her legal standing in court. She fully believed she had won. She believed she had successfully stolen my life's work without a trace. She had merely signed her own conviction. The paper trail was perfect. The beauty of a perfectly constructed trap is that the prey never feels the steel jaws until it is far too late to run. As my vocal cords slowly regained their function, my hospital room transformed from a place of quiet desperation into a strategic command center. Hannah sat at the edge of my bed with her laptop open, the glow of the screen reflecting in her tired but determined eyes. It was time to unleash the weapon I had prepared months before I ever fell ill. Open my encrypted email, I whispered, my voice sounding like crushed leaves. Find the contact for Vivian. Vivian was the lead corporate attorney for the massive pediatric nonprofit I had been negotiating with. When we drafted the preliminary merger agreement for my clinic, she insisted on an airtight security clause. Because the nonprofit received substantial federal grants, any unauthorized transfer of assets exceeding $10,000 from my clinic's accounts would automatically trigger a mandatory third-party forensic audit. It was designed to prevent embezzlement. It was a corporate poison pill. Madeline, in her frantic greed, had bypassed my personal savings and dipped directly into the clinic's operational reserves to pay the $50,000 deposit for Jessica's wedding venue in Italy. She thought the emergency conservatorship gave her absolute financial immunity. She was entirely uneducated in the brutal realities of corporate compliance law. Draft a message to Vivian 1, instructed Hannah, taking slow, deliberate breaths to manage the pain in my chest. Tell her, the owner of the clinic is incapacitated, and an unauthorized withdrawal of $50,000 has just been executed by a temporary conservator. Hannah's fingers flew across the keyboard. She didn't ask questions. She understood exactly what we were doing. By sending that email, we were officially alerting a federal-level legal team that potential fraud was occurring within their merging assets. Message sent, Hannah said quietly, closing the laptop. There were no sirens. There were no flashing lights. But in that exact moment, an invisible, devastating financial investigation was quietly launched against my mother. A team of forensic accountants would now be tracing every single penny Madeline had moved. She was planning a luxury wedding, completely unaware that she had just invited federal auditors to the reception. The countdown had officially begun. Ignorance breeds a very specific kind of dangerous arrogance. Believing she had successfully conquered the hospital administration and secured my funds, Madeline shifted her focus entirely to finalizing her permanent control. She instructed her shady attorney to file a motion for an expedited hearing, claiming that the mounting medical bills were putting my estate in imminent peril. The probate judge, seeing a seemingly devastated mother trying to prevent financial ruin, granted the hearing for that coming Friday morning. While Madeline was busy filing expedited court documents, Jessica was documenting her supposed grief on social media. Hannah showed me a post Jessica had uploaded from a high-end bridal boutique. She was standing in a silk gown, holding a glass of champagne with a caption that read, "Trying to find moments of light during my family's darkest tragedy. Aaliyah would want me to smile today." It was absolutely nauseating. They were celebrating my impending death with champagne bought with my own money. But while Jessica was trying on veils, I was enduring the most agonizing physical therapy of my entire life. To dismantle their lies in court, I could not just send a lawyer. I had to be there in person. I had to prove cognitive awareness. Dr. Galvin brought in a specialized physical therapist to help me reconnect the misfiring signals between my brain and my muscles. Every attempt to sit up sent shockwaves of blinding pain down my spine. Needles of agony pricked at my nerve endings as I forced my legs to bear even a fraction of my weight. I did not cry. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, forcing my body to obey my commands. I thought about Leo. I thought about the terrified little boy who was relying on me to protect him from the coldness of the foster system. He was my anchor. Every painful stretch, every agonizing movement was fueled by the burning necessity to keep Madeline's hands away from his future. Have you ever had to prepare an escape route because you couldn't trust your own family? If this resonates with you, let me know in the comments below. I was not going to let them win. To safely leave the intensive care unit and enter a courtroom, I needed the full legal backing of Boston General Hospital. Madeline had threatened their administration with massive lawsuits, painting them as greedy villains to the local press. The hospital executives were nervous, constantly worrying about the public relations nightmare Madeline had manufactured. It was time to give them the ultimate legal shield. On Thursday afternoon, I asked Dr. Galvin to bring the hospital's chief legal counsel into my room. A stern-looking man in a sharp suit walked in, expecting to find a severely compromised patient. Instead, he found me sitting upright in bed, my eyes clear and my voice steady, albeit quiet. 3 years ago, I told the attorney, looking him directly in the eye, I had my primary care physician upload a specific notarized document into my permanent sealed medical file. I need you to pull it right now. The attorney frowned, opening his secure tablet to access the deep archives of my records. He scrolled for a few moments before stopping abruptly. His eyes widened, and a slow, distinct look of realization spread across his face. "You have a designated medical power of attorney," he breathed out, turning the screen toward Dr. Galvin, "appointing Hannah as your sole healthcare proxy in the event of incapacitation." "Exactly," I replied calmly, "which means my mother committed blatant perjury on her emergency conservatorship application when she swore under oath that I had no designated representative. She lied to a judge to bypass hospital protocol." The legal dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The hospital was no longer on the defensive. Madeline's threats of suing them for holding me hostage were now completely baseless because the hospital was legally obligated to follow Hannah's directives, not Madeline's. The attorney let out a short, humorless laugh, realizing the incredible leverage I had just handed him. "We will arrange a secure medical transport for you tomorrow morning, Aaliyah," the attorney said, closing his tablet with a sharp snap. "And we will gladly send our legal representative to accompany you to court. Your mother has caused a lot of trouble for this hospital." The trap was now fully armed. Friday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that swept off the Boston harbor. It was the day of the permanent conservatorship hearing. The day Madeline fully expected a judge to hand her the absolute legal rights to my life, my clinic, and my bank accounts. According to mutual acquaintances who were present at the courthouse, Madeline and Jessica arrived looking like grieving widows from a high-fashion magazine. They wore perfectly tailored, somber black dresses. Madeline carried a designer tissue box, periodically dabbing at her dry eyes for the benefit of the courthouse staff. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime, playing the roles of the heartbroken family, burdened with the tragic duty of letting a loved one go. Miles away, inside the quiet sanctuary of my hospital room, the atmosphere was entirely different. There were no tears. There was no dramatic mourning. Hannah helped me change out of the sterile hospital gown and into a soft, simple beige sweater and comfortable trousers. My body was still weak, my muscles trembling with exhaustion, but my mind was a fortified steel vault. Hannah carefully helped me transfer from the bed into a sleek automated wheelchair provided by the hospital. Dr. Galvin stood by the door, reviewing my vitals one last time. He gave me a brief, reassuring nod. There was a quiet, shared understanding among the three of us. We were not going to court to argue or plead. We were going to perform a surgical strike on a foundation of lies. I looked at my reflection in the small bathroom mirror. I looked pale and fragile, a stark contrast to the vibrant woman I usually was. But my eyes were sharp. They were the eyes of a woman who had survived a failing heart and a ruthless family. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs without the aid of a machine. "Are you ready?" Hannah asked softly, placing her hands on the handles of my wheelchair. "Let's go," I whispered. The door clicked shut. The probate courtroom smelled of old polished oak and stale bureaucracy. It was a heavy, intimidating room designed to make people feel small. Madeline took her seat at the petitioner's table, her shady attorney sitting confidently beside her. The judge, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, adjusted her glasses and looked down at the thick stack of files Madeline had submitted. "Mrs. Madeline," the judge began, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "You are petitioning for permanent conservatorship over your daughter Aaliyah, citing irreversible cognitive damage and prolonged incapacitation. You are also requesting the immediate liquidation of her business assets to cover medical debts and the formal withdrawal of her pending adoption petition for a minor named Leo. Is this correct?" Madeline stood up slowly, gripping the edge of the table as if struggling to support her own weight. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice cracking perfectly on cue. "It breaks my heart. But the doctors have told us there is no hope. My beautiful girl is trapped in a shell. The hospital is draining her estate with daily fees, and it would be a cruelty to let a disabled child like Leo believe she can still be his mother. I just want to manage this tragedy responsibly." It was a brilliant, disgusting monologue. She had expertly woven financial prudence with fake maternal mercy. The judge nodded slowly, seemingly moved by the tragic narrative. She picked up her pen, preparing to sign the decree that would officially hand my entire existence over to a woman who saw me as nothing more than an ATM. If you are waiting for the exact moment karma strikes, keep listening, because it is happening right now. The judge hovered her pen over the signature line. Unless there are any objections from interested parties, the judge announced to the mostly empty room, "I am prepared to grant this motion." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly clicked. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a deep, echoing groan. There was no dramatic music, no sudden shouting. There was only the steady, rhythmic squeak of rubber wheels rolling across the polished hardwood floor. Hannah pushed my wheelchair slowly down the center aisle, her posture rigid and fiercely protective. Dr. Galvin walked half a step behind us, carrying a thick, sealed manila folder. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not look at the floor. I kept my eyes locked directly on the petitioner's table. Madeline was in the middle of pressing a pristine white tissue to her cheek when she heard the wheels. She turned her head. The tissue slipped from her fingers, fluttering silently to the floor. The color drained from her face so rapidly it looked as if she had been physically struck. Her jaw went slack, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Beside her, Jessica gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning bone white. She looked exactly like someone who had just seen a ghost. In a way, they had. They were staring at the woman they had already buried in their minds. The bailiff stepped forward, unsure of how to handle the sudden interruption. The judge peered over her glasses, her hand freezing over the signature line of the permanent conservatorship decree. The entire courtroom descended into a thick, suffocating silence. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents. I did not scream at them. I did not demand justice or throw a tearful tantrum about betrayal. Calmness is the ultimate weapon against people who thrive on chaos. I waited until Hannah parked my wheelchair directly in front of the judge's bench, right beside the table where Madeline and her lawyer were sitting, frozen in absolute shock. I looked up at the judge. My voice was quiet, raspy from the breathing tubes, but it carried perfectly through the dead, silent room. "Good morning, Your Honor," I said, keeping my tone as even as if I were reading a patient's chart. "My name is Aaliyah. I apologize for interrupting the proceedings, but I believe it is necessary to inform the court that I am very much alive and entirely conscious." Madeline's lawyer looked at his client, panic flashing in his eyes. He realized instantly that he had been fed a monumental lie. The woman sitting in the wheelchair was not a brain-dead vegetable. The courtroom held its breath. The judge lowered her pen and folded her hands, her sharp eyes studying my face, then moving to Madeline and finally settling on Dr. Galvin. "Are you the attending physician?" she asked, her voice tight with sudden authority. "I am, Your Honor." "Dr. Galvin, Chief of Intensive Care at Boston General," he replied, stepping forward and placing the heavy manila folder on the judge's bench. "And I am here to formally submit my patient's authentic, unedited medical records into evidence. The documentation currently before the court provided by the petitioner has been grossly misrepresented." Madeline finally found her voice. It was a high, frantic squeak. "She's confused, Your Honor. She just woke up. The brain damage. She doesn't know what she's saying." I turned my head slightly to look at Madeline. I did not glare. I just looked at her with a profound, clinical emptiness. "I am not confused, Madeline," I said softly. "I remember everything." I turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, the medical records you are currently holding outline my acute cardiac failure. They also contain a very specific incident report dated from my second day in the ICU. When my doctor stated that I needed an immediate, specialized intervention to survive the petitioner, my mother refused to provide financial authorization." A collective gasp rippled through the few spectators in the gallery. The judge began flipping through the authentic file, her expression hardening with every page she read. Furthermore, I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "She legally executed a Do Not Resuscitate order against medical advice. She did not file for this conservatorship to manage my health care. She filed it because she was actively trying to expedite my death." Madeline shook her head wildly, tears welling up, this time tears of genuine terror. "That is a lie. I was protecting her from suffering. The doctors said the surgery was risky. I was making a mother's hardest choice." Dr. Galvin did not even look at her. "The procedure had a 90% success rate, Your Honor. I explicitly informed the petitioner of this fact. She chose the DNR anyway." The judge stared down at the official hospital logs, seeing Madeline's signature neatly authorizing the cessation of my life support. The medical lie was dead. "If she didn't want to ease your suffering," the judge asked, leaning forward, her voice dropping into a dangerous icy register, "why would your mother legally authorize a Do Not Resuscitate order?" This was the moment. This was the exact second the carefully constructed facade of the grieving, loving family was obliterated. I reached into the pocket of my sweater and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. Hannah stepped forward and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. "Because, Your Honor," I said quietly, "saving my life was going to be expensive, and Madeline had other financial obligations." The judge unfolded the paper. It was a certified bank statement pulled directly from my private accounts that Madeline had accessed using the temporary emergency conservatorship. While I was trapped in a locked-in state entirely dependent on a ventilator to breathe, I explained, looking directly at Jessica, whose face was now buried in her trembling hands. "My temporary conservator authorized an immediate wire transfer of $50,000. That money did not go to Boston General Hospital. It did not go to a medical trust." The judge read the highlighted transaction line. Her jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle jumping in her cheek. "It went to a luxury event planning company in Florence, Italy," I stated, my words cutting through the air like precision scalpels. "It was the final deposit for my sister's destination wedding. My mother weighed the cost of my cardiac surgery against the price of a Tuscan villa, and she chose the villa." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a fatal car crash. Even Madeline's lawyer physically leaned away from her, staring at the bank statement on the judge's desk with wide, horrified eyes. He was a shady attorney, but even he knew that redirecting medical conservatorship funds to a wedding planner while the ward was dying was an indefensible felony. Madeline had traded my heartbeat for a champagne toast, and now the entire legal system was staring directly at the receipt. The illusion was completely shattered. When a narcissist loses control of the narrative, they do not apologize. They do not reflect or seek forgiveness. They panic, and in this panic, they inevitably expose the darkest corners of their own minds. Madeline slammed her hands on the table, her carefully maintained posture completely disintegrating. "You don't understand," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. She was a bad investment. Ever since she was a child, her medical bills have drained this family. We sacrificed everything for her heart. The judge watched her utterly repulsed, but allowed her to keep talking. Madeline was digging her own grave with every word. The wedding was already planned. Madeline continued, her voice echoing frantically. Jessica had the dress. The guests had booked their flights. If we paid for that expensive heart surgery, Aaliyah's accounts would be frozen for years. The money would just sit there while Jessica's life was ruined. Aaliyah was practically gone anyway. Why should both of my daughters suffer? It was a masterclass in toxic justification. In her mind, stealing my life savings to fund a party was an act of maternal sacrifice for Jessica. She truly believed that my inability to stay healthy was a selfish attack on her social standing. Jessica, realizing the catastrophic legal implications of her mother's confession, grabbed Madeline's arm, pulling her down. "Mom, stop talking! Please, just stop talking!" Jessica hissed, sobbing into her designer sleeves. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. For 28 years, I had craved her validation. I had worked myself to the bone, trying to prove I was worthy of the oxygen I consumed. But sitting in that courtroom, listening to her publicly admit that she valued a party over my existence, the last remaining thread of my childhood guilt snapped. I felt completely, wonderfully free. I didn't owe her a single thing. The judge slowly shook her head, picking up her gavel. "In my 20 years on the bench," she said, her voice laced with pure venom, "I have rarely seen such a breathtaking display of moral bankruptcy." She buried her own case. Just as the judge raised her gavel to officially dismiss the petition, Madeline's lawyer made one final desperate play to save his own career. He stood up abruptly, pulling a fresh document from his briefcase. He was sweating profusely. "Your Honor, wait," the lawyer blurted out. "We contest the patient's capacity to represent herself. I have here a signed evaluation from Dr. Aris, a licensed psychiatrist." He reviewed Aaliyah's chart and concluded that she is suffering from severe post-coma anoxic brain injury. She is exhibiting extreme paranoia and delusions. She is legally unfit, and the conservatorship must remain in place for her own safety. It was the false counterattack, the ultimate gaslighting maneuver. If she couldn't kill me, she would simply have me declared legally insane and lock me in a psychiatric ward to keep the money. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice to argue my sanity. I simply turned my wheelchair slightly and nodded toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room. The doors opened again. A tall, impeccably dressed woman walked down the aisle, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. It was Vivian, the lead corporate attorney for the federal nonprofit I was merging with. "Your Honor," Vivian said smoothly, completely ignoring Madeline and her sweating lawyer. "I represent the National Healthcare Organization currently in the final stages of a corporate merger with Aaliyah's clinic. 3 days ago, my office was alerted to an unauthorized withdrawal of $50,000 from an account tied to our pending merger." Vivian handed a thick-bound report directly to the judge. "Because those funds are legally tied to federal pediatric grants via our merger contract, this unauthorized transfer triggered an automatic poison pill clause. What you are holding is a completed forensic audit conducted by federal investigators. It definitively proves that the petitioner Madeline has committed federal wire fraud and embezzlement. The FBI has already been notified." Madeline's lawyer stared at Vivian, all the blood leaving his face. Federal wire fraud. He immediately backed away from his client's table, dropping the fake psychiatric evaluation as if it were on fire. "Your Honor," he stammered, raising his hands, "I formally withdraw my motion. I withdraw as counsel for the petitioner." Madeline sat frozen, her eyes wide with terror as she realized the true depth of the trap I had set. I hadn't just protected my money. I had weaponized it. The judge slammed the gavel down with a deafening crack. "Emergency conservatorship revoked entirely. This case is dismissed and all evidence is being forwarded to the district attorney." The paper empire was gone. The fallout from a federal forensic audit does not happen in slow motion. It is a swift, brutal, and mathematically precise execution. When you strike at the foundation of a narcissist's world with undeniable evidence of federal wire fraud, the collapse is absolute. I did not have to lift another finger. I simply went back to the hospital, focused on my physical therapy, and let the legal gears of the justice system grind Madeline's carefully curated life into fine dust. By Monday morning, less than 72 hours after our courtroom confrontation, the Economic Crimes Division had officially frozen every single financial account tied to Madeline's name. Because the $50,000 she had wired to Italy was fundamentally tied to my federally backed nonprofit merger, the authorities treated the embezzlement with the utmost severity. The asset freeze cascaded, hitting Jessica's accounts as well, since Madeline had been funneling money directly to her to cover various wedding expenses. I heard the details of the aftermath from Vivian, who kept me updated on the legal proceedings. The luxury event planners in Florence, upon receiving a notice of fraudulent funds and an impending federal clawback, immediately canceled the wedding contract. Jessica, who had spent months bragging online about her exclusive destination ceremony, was suddenly left with a mountain of non-refundable secondary expenses and zero access to cash. The social humiliation was entirely devastating for them. Jessica's wealthy fiancé, whose family prided themselves on their pristine corporate reputation, took one look at the federal wire fraud investigation surrounding his future mother-in-law and immediately broke off engagement. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with the family currently being scrutinized by the FBI. Jessica was left standing in her leased luxury SUV, which was soon repossessed when the automated payments bounced. As for Madeline, the grand illusion of her high society life evaporated overnight. Without access to her credit lines or my savings, she could no longer afford the exorbitant rent on her upscale downtown apartment. Her so-called friends from the charity luncheon stopped returning her calls the minute the local news caught wind of the fraud investigation. She was entirely ostracized. To pay for her criminal defense attorney because her previous lawyer had abandoned her, she had to liquidate her jewelry, her designer clothes, and her pristine furniture. She eventually had to move into a tiny rundown studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. The last I heard, she was working as a receptionist at a minor dental clinic, forced to answer phones for minimum wage just to keep the electricity on. I did not gloat. I did not drive past her new apartment to laugh at her misery. I felt a profound, peaceful detachment. The universe had simply balanced the ledger. I opened my phone permanently, blocked both of their numbers, and erased them from my contacts. There was nothing left to say. I never looked back. Healing is not a linear process. It takes time to rebuild muscle, and it takes even longer to recalibrate a nervous system that was fully prepared to shut down forever. I spent the next 6 months dedicating myself entirely to physical therapy and the finalization of the nonprofit merger. I walked with a slight limp for a while, and my chest still ached when the weather turned cold, but every breath I took was a victory. I had fought for my right to exist, and I had won. But the true victory did not happen in that cold probate courtroom. The real triumph occurred on a bright, crisp Tuesday morning in family court. I stood in the hallway wearing a soft floral dress holding the hand of a 6-year-old boy. Leo was wearing a tiny suit with a crooked bow tie, his eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. Hannah was standing on his other side, smoothing down his hair, while Dr. Galvin stood near the door, holding a small wrapped gift for him. The atmosphere in this courtroom was entirely different. There was no heavy oak smell of impending doom, no shady lawyers whispering in the corners. The room was bathed in warm sunlight pouring through large windows. The judge on the bench was smiling warmly, looking down at the thick stack of paperwork I had submitted. Aaliyah, the judge, said kindly, "I have reviewed all the evaluations, the background checks, and the home studies. It is wonderfully clear that this child has found his safe harbor." I looked down at Leo. He squeezed my fingers, looking up at me with absolute unwavering trust. He didn't care about the balance in my bank account. He didn't care if I drove an old sedan or if my heart was physically scarred. He just cared that I was there holding his hand exactly when I promised I would be. The judge handed the official adoption decree down to the clerk, who placed it on the table in front of me. I picked up the pen. Months ago, my mother had used a pen to sign a Do Not Resuscitate order, attempting to erase my existence for a few $1,000s. She had used signatures as weapons of destruction. Now, holding this pen, I was doing the exact opposite. I was using a signature to create life, to build a future, and to guarantee that a little boy would never feel the cold, terrifying sting of abandonment again. I signed my name with a steady hand. The judge banged her gavel lightly, offering a bright smile. "Congratulations, he is officially your son." Leo threw his arms around my waist, burying his face in my dress. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered. He was finally home. When you spend your entire life navigating a minefield of emotional manipulation and financial abuse, the absence of chaos feels incredibly strange at first. You keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. You keep waiting for the phone to ring with a new demand or a new crisis. But eventually the silence settles in, and you realize that the peace is permanent. It was a Sunday morning, and the sunlight was streaming through the large bay windows of the newly expanded rehabilitation center. The merger with the national nonprofit had provided us with the resources to renovate a beautiful historic property near the water. We had transformed it into a state-of-the-art facility for disabled children, complete with a residential wing for families who needed a place to stay during long-term treatments. The air smelled of fresh coffee and warm cinnamon rolls. Hannah was sitting at the large rustic dining table we had placed in the staff kitchen, laughing as she tried to help Leo assemble a complicated puzzle. Dr. Galvin, who had officially joined our board of directors as a medical advisor, was leaning against the counter, sipping his tea and smiling at the chaotic scene. I stood near the window holding my own mug, just watching them. This was the life I had fought for. This was the family I had actively chosen. In my old life, family gatherings were a terrifying ordeal. They were carefully staged performances where Madeline scrutinized everyone's clothing, where Jessica demanded all the attention, and where I was expected to sit quietly and foot the bill for whatever luxury they deemed necessary. Every meal was a transaction. Every conversation was a calculation. But looking at Hannah Galvin and Leo, I realized what a true family actually looks like. It is built on mutual respect, unconditional support, and shared values. It is knowing that if I ever collapsed again, these people would tear down the walls of the hospital to keep me safe, rather than looking for a legal loophole to liquidate my assets. They didn't look at me and see a price tag. They looked at me and saw Aaliyah. They saw a mother, a nurse, a friend, and a survivor. The toxic chains that had bound me to Madeline and Jessica's twisted reality were completely broken. I had stopped trying to earn a seat at a table where I was secretly despised, and instead I had built my own. We built our own table. People often ask me if I have ever considered reaching out to Madeline or Jessica. Society places a tremendous unfair burden on the victims of family abuse to forgive and forget. We are constantly bombarded with phrases like, "But she is still your mother," or "Family is blood, you only get one." I fundamentally reject that narrative. Forgiveness is a beautiful, powerful concept, but it strictly requires the offending party to acknowledge their wrongdoing, feel genuine remorse, and actively seek redemption. Madeline and Jessica never felt remorse for trying to let me die. They only felt sorry that my corporate poison pill caught them and that they lost their money, their social standing, and their luxury wedding. They were entirely willing to sacrifice my life and Leo's future for a party in Italy. You cannot heal a relationship with someone who fundamentally views your existence as an inconvenience to their lifestyle. So no, I do not forgive them. I do not speak to them, and I do not feel a single ounce of guilt about it. If you are listening to this and you are the black sheep of your family, the financial safety net, or the one whose sacrifices are constantly expected but never acknowledged, I need you to hear me clearly. Setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty. Walking away from a toxic dynamic is not a failure. It is the purest, most necessary form of survival. You do not owe anyone your sanity. You do not owe anyone your financial security. And you absolutely do not owe anyone your life, not even the people who brought you into this world. If the people at your table look at you and only see what they can extract from you, it is time to leave that table immediately. My mother believed that a legacy was measured by the designer labels in her closet and the zip code of her apartment. She was wrong. A legacy is not what you inherit from the people who came before you. A legacy is what you have the courage to protect and the love you manage to leave behind. I am Aaliyah. I survived a failing heart, a ruthless conservatorship, and the absolute worst of human greed. I protected my son, I protected my life's work, and I built a sanctuary where love does not come with a price tag. If you have stayed with me until this very last word, you belong to an exclusive group. You are part of the 1% of people who possess the empathy and the patience to truly understand a survivor's journey. I want you to drop the letter W in the comments section right now. W stands for winner. It lets me know who the absolute best, most compassionate members of this community are. If my story resonated with you, please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. We will continue navigating these complex human stories together. Protect your peace always.